during the war, the Navy had a program called V12, where if you got into that program, they would send you to school, a college, a university for 4 years, after which time you would be a midshipman at that time. You would be then commissioned an ensign, and you would be required to put in 4 more years to the Navy to pay them back. So I went down and applied for this. I was going to Washington University as an art major and working part-time in the Wabash Railroad offices downtown St. Louis. A rather difficult condition, and living at home. So I went down and I passed this written exam perfectly. Went back in, passed the physical, and then they said, well, now we don't have any vacancies right now. We have a list in there, but we'll notify you. So I said, all right. I continued on with my previous life, and then I met one of the students in my anatomy class at the university, and she was trying to do the same thing. And she got the same answer. But then she found out, somebody told her, that the Coast Guard offered this because they were part of the Navy at the time, but that they had a much shorter waiting list because they were a smaller organization. So she went down there and changed hers and joined the Coast Guard. So I thought, well, I can take a chance on that. And she came back a month or so later and said, hey, the Coast Guard called me. I'm not going to the V12, but I'm getting to Officers Candidate School in, I think it's in Connecticut. So I said, okay, I'm going to take a chance. So I went down and joined the office, to the recruitment office of the Coast Guard, talked to them. Oh, sure, your score, which is very good, will carry over right with you. And as soon as we get a vacancy, you can expect to go. I believed him. Don't ever believe a recruiter. They're paid to distort the truth. So anyhow, I said, okay. So I went back to school, finished up that semester, and they said, okay, you're called up boot camp, which was in San Francisco, or Alameda, actually, in the East Bay area. And I took a train with a bunch of other people from St. Louis to San Francisco, or rather to Oakland, and over to Alameda, and found myself in this boot camp, which was, I guess, something that everybody went through in some sort of basic training boot camp, whatever the service, or you call it, that particular branch. And I got through that, and they gave me these aptitude tests, and I said, well, I don't need to take that. They're going to call me for this V12 program. So I said, you still got to take it. I said, okay. And so I sat down, and I looked through these aptitude tests. He called me a little later and said, okay, we're going to go over these things. You qualify for a whole lot of things. What would you like to do most? Well, my mother had been a nurse. I said, oh, well, I think I'd rather just do pharmacist mate, which is what they call it in those days. I think it's corpsman now, but anyhow. And so they said, okay, we'll put that down. You have to have 2 more. I said, well, that quartermaster looks pretty interesting. Put me in for that. All right, 1 more. I said, well, read those names off to me. And he read a whole slew of names to me. I said, put me down for radio man. Of course, what did I get? Radio man, the 3rd choice. And they sent me cross-country from Oakland to Atlantic City, New Jersey, where the Coast Guard School was, in the Morton Hotel, which is shown in that together. We served Michael Dell. Managed to go around, and he found a picture of that Morton Hotel. It's in there, which was not bad duty. They put you up in the hotel, which was in rooms, not in the barracks, and you ate in a mess hall, and some of the hotel staff were still there. They did a lot of other things. You didn't have to work in the KP. So it was not too bad an experience. And we were there, and it was a 6-month school. You had to do 20 words per minute, copy and receive. So I finally got through that part of it, and I had an interesting thing there. They had a big banquet after the thing was over. Each class would do that in another hotel, not in the one we were living in. And so they had a big cover, a program for that. And so since I was an artist and they knew it, they had me cut out of a lot of these boring classes that they were instructing on and sit in there and draw up the program for the graduation ceremony, which I still have a copy of, and it was a very good job. So if I do say so myself. And so then I got through with that. They said, well, give all your people 10 days leave, which I took, which was very disappointing because none of my friends were around anymore, too. They'd all joined up by that time, and there was much to do. So anyhow, I went back, and they sent me to Philadelphia district headquarters. And I was there about 2 weeks. We were supposed to be taking messages and taking them into cryptology, having them decoded, but they weren't sending them by the Morse code. They were sending them by teletype. So one day I ripped off a message from the teletype, passed it into the communications slot for decoding, and in about 5 minutes, this young ensign comes out, and she's laughing. And I said, what's the matter? She said, you know what that message was you just gave me? No, that was the order for you and Sam, who was the other fellow in the class that was in there with me, to report to Casco Bay to undergo Navy undersea warfare training. I knew nothing about it. Nobody else did. And so Sammy and I went to Casco Bay, Maine, a little island out there. There's several islands out there in that Casco Bay. I was through there about 2011, I guess it was. We took a cruise up the coast. They stopped in Portland, and they took us to other little places. And you could see little islands out there. I said, well, which one has a Navy training center? He says, huh? Which one has? Because nobody's living on any of those islands doing anything. Everything's been demolished. Do you know which island it was? No. So I have no idea where it was that I was. But I was out there in Casco Bay. I would never spend any time in Portland because coming from St. Louis, I was a big baseball fan. And as soon as I got liberty, I was on a boat, a little launch to get me to Portland, on a train to Boston, down to Fenway Park to watch the Boston Red Sox. And Ted Williams was still with them at the time, and Johnny Pesky and a few of the other great players who later were taken into the military. And it was wonderful just to sit in this famous Fenway Park and watch baseball. And Boston was a great town for liberty. You couldn't buy anything in that town. The tickets were free. The USO put you up free for the night, and you go in a restaurant or something, somebody buy your meal for you. Wonderful place, Boston. So anyhow, that didn't last too long, unfortunately. And we got through what we were supposed to, what we were doing in that undersea, our anti-submarine school. The Navy had several different functions out there, all anti-submarine. Our branch was to take, as we were radio men, to take bearings on the Morse code transmitted by the Germans, because the submarine could not transmit underwater. They could receive, but they could not transmit. So they would have to come up, when they saw a ship, they would have to come up and transmit to the shore station, who would then round up the other submarines in the area to make that the famous wolf packs. And they would go out there and try and sink the convoy or the ship or whatever they had in sight. And so we were supposed to take bearings on the submarine. When they came up with some direction finding equipment, looked like something like a radar scope today, very smaller though, and very primitive, but it did give you a presentation on a cathode ray tube. And you would get the bearing, you would pull that in, and then to the net control, they would get one from every other ship in the area where they crossed. Very good chance that was where the submarine actually was. They would then send over a destroyer or someone with a depth charge and destroy the submarine. Hopefully that was the way it worked. The Germans have 8 different Morse code characters that take care of these umlauts in the language of the Germans. So we would sit there and copy their shore stations. It didn't make any difference why we had to copy those. I don't know, because all the stuff that they were sending was in code, and we couldn't decipher it anyhow. We only supposed to take bearings on. So we got through that class, and they sent 30 of us down to Norfolk, Virginia, a big Navy base. Today, that's much pleasanter. In those days, it was not pleasant. As you can read in that timeline I have on there, where Michael Meister did on the side, it says, sailors and dogs stay off the grass. That's about the way it was. And we went in, and Norfolk was dirty, it was hot, it was in the summer. And we sat there and sat there and sat there, because we have to be split up on either Navy or Coast Guard, small ships, Coast Guard cutter, Navy destroyer, escort, patrol frigate, and go out there and take these bearings. The blustery, bumpy, cold North Atlantic. So while we're sitting in there, someone in Washington, which did not communicate with anybody else any better than they do today, someone in one of those things got an idea, said, if you can take a bearing on a submarine in the water, why can't you take a bearing on an airplane in the sky? And we were moving the war out to the Pacific. More and more supplies and people were going out by plane. And the planes, it was hard for them to locate one little coral outcropping from another coral outcropping, which I can understand. There were no navigation aids on them, of course. And so they kept getting, as they would say, unsure of their position. Pilots are never lost, only unsure. So we decided, they said, well, we're going to develop this. They got some FCC engineer who whipped out a quick DF for airplanes. They said, well, what are we going to do with this program? Oh, well, the Coast Guard usually handles search and rescue. Let's give it to them. All right. Where are we going to train them? Well, we've got this Coast Guard school in Atlantic City in the Martin Hotel. We can make room for them. Okay. And where are we going to get the first class? There's a bunch of guys, mostly Coast Guard, sitting down there in Norfolk. Let's take those people and send them into the first class so we can get out of Norfolk. And so we got there, and it was Atlantic City in the summer. All the piers were open. The shows were going on. The hotels were open. The restaurants were open. It was great. And so we went through that period there, checked out on their equipment, all set to go. They said, okay, you go down to Honolulu, and you'll establish bases in Hawaii, and then you're going to go out into the Pacific and put in bases out there on these little islands as we capture them. All right. We set out, and we finally got through that, and reluctantly bid farewell to Atlantic City and went out in the ocean in a merchant marine ship that I think must have been a leftover from World War I. It broke down in the middle of the Pacific with both engines running. Both engines broke down. They got one of them going. We limped in several days late to Pearl Harbor with, of course, no fans going, no any way to put heat into the rest of the ship, so we slept up on the deck. And a little crowded, but we did. Finally limped into Pearl Harbor. The warrant officer, who was in charge of getting us there, looked up on the dock and he couldn't see any Coast Guard transport vehicles. He said, He came back. He said, I don't see anything up there, boys, but we'll just wait. So we waited. He went back up again. Still nothing. He said, I'm going to call down to headquarters. So he called Coast Guard headquarters in Honolulu. They had heard nothing from Washington. They didn't know we were coming. He said, we're here. He said, who are you? And he said, we're the guys who are supposed to put up these DF stations. What DF stations? They had no equipment, no places to put them. I had no idea we were even coming. So they hauled us down to the Coast Guard base down there and let us sit around there while they referred it up to SINCPAC, Commander-in-Chief Pacific. Well, SINCPAC checked around, which is what somebody should have done long ago. Found out that the Army Air Corps, through their section, was known as the Army Airways Communication System, the AACS, was already doing this in Hawaii and had plans to go out into the Pacific. So the word came down from Admiral Emmett's office, detach those 30 men to the Air Corps. So there we were, detached to the Air Corps. And we were taken down, given Army uniforms, Army helmets, Army carbines, all this Army equipment. And then we went to their north shore of Oahu, a little base called Mokalea. I was out there in 2011 or 2012, and my daughter drove me around out there, and it's still there, but it's a glider and parachute jumping school now, belongs to the state. So anyhow, we went there, and the first day we went down to take class at the training that the Army Air Corps provided there, and we had to, first of all, check out on the equipment that they had. What did they use? It was different. What did they use? They used the exact same equipment that the Navy used for submarines. No special equipment for aircraft. They're using the same equipment. we got through with that pretty quick. And we went, they split us up, sent us to the Army units that were already in Hawaii there. In Hawaii, Honolulu, Maui, and Hawaii. So two or three of us, I think about four of us actually, went to Kauai. There's some Army people there. We integrated with them, saw how they did it for the thing. We worked there. So then they said to Dave Morris and myself, you two report to Hickam. You're being transferred. Where are we going? All you know is you're going to Hickam. You'll find out from there. Okay. So we went to Hickam. And we went from Hickam to Kwajalein. Now, Kwajalein was the staging area there. Some more of the fellows came in that had been over in our class and went over in Hawaii or on Maui. And so they had quite a few of us there. And then they divided it up to go out and put in these various stations. Well, Boris and I were both assigned to Tarawa, along with three other fellows from other classes. So we got out to Tarawa. The Army had the equipment. They had the location for it. They had the personnel to hook it up and put it in. And just a matter of days, we were up taking bearings on lost airplanes. Would that the Coast Guard and the Navy had known about this. But anyhow, that got me that far. Now, well, it was Kwajalein was secure by that time. They'd captured it about a year, I guess, or something like that before we went in there. It was pretty much a mess still. The palm trees were all shot down, and there were lots of big holes in the ground where they hadn't filled in the bomb shells and all of that sort of thing. And we weren't there very long, but while we were there, there was a sudden alert that some of the Emperor's aircraft were heading this way meaning to Kwajalein. So we went down these little air raid trenches they had and sat down there until the all-clear sounded. Apparently, the Navy had scrambled the planes off of Kwajalein, and they came back. All of them came back, and no Japanese planes came through, so I do presume that they were repulsed somewhere out there in the Pacific. And that was, it was hot. Of course, it was hot in all those islands out there. We were only there for a week or so, and they divided us up. And then they sent Dave Morris and I and two other fellows from other classes. I think there were about five of us total out there to Kwajalein, to Tarawa. Or as they say today, Tarawa. In those days they called it Tarawa, but today it's Tarawa.
In your reflections, you mentioned your dog, Mickey. How did you end up with a dog in the middle of a war zone?
Well, on Tarawa, that was a British crown colony before the war. The Japanese took it over, and the British officers had these fine boxers, dogs. They had sleek, beautiful animals, and those, of course, belonged to the British officers. And when the Japanese came in, they took over the island. They took over everything they could, and they took over the British dogs. Well, when we came in, we took over the island and everything else we had got, and we took over the British dogs. Now, these may have been a little old, so they may have been the descendants of the original dogs, but they were still fine-looking dogs, well-trained, well-behaved. They would trot around with their officer masters. And, of course, we as lowly enlisted men, we just look out and say, gee, I wish I had a dog like that. I wish I had a dog like that. Well, I really wished I had one. And so I never had one when I was growing up. And the word got out, and some Army fellow stopped by in a Jeep one day at the tent area. We lived in tents out there with mosquito netting all over it. I think I saw some pictures of those sketches I drew. I took a sketchbook with me out there, and I had a whole lot of sketches that I did in the war. But anyhow, I was out there, and he comes back and says, hey, are you looking for a dog? I said, well, yeah, I'd sure like to have one. Hey, there's one for sale down at the native compound down there. That's where the Micronesian natives lived. They worked on the island, did manual labor, worked for the government. They had fled the island when the Japanese came in, but when we went in, they came back. So we went down there, and here was this little puppy, I don't know, must have been not more than about a month, 6 weeks old, roly-poly, just as round and fat as you can think of. And of course, now this is a different culture completely. They were stuffing him with rice, getting him fat to have him as the entree for one of their feasts. I couldn't let that happen. So I said, how much do you want for this dog? And she said, "No, I want money." I said, well, what do you want? You want trench knife? I said, oh, that trench knife, that's government power. I can't give that to you. I'm signed out for that trench knife. Want trench knife? Well, look, how much money? I'll give you more money. You can buy yourself a knife. Me want trench knife. Well, what did I do? I didn't know what would happen when I went back. I had to turn in all that Army gear. But I said, okay. And I went back, got my trench knife. We computed the deal. I brought the little round roly puppy. He was so glad. He knew he'd been rescued from something. And so I just fed him on milk, which was powdered milk, of course, and diluted. Fed him for days on that. So I cleaned him all out, got him down to a normal size, and then started just feeding him bring back from the mess hall. And he was, well, that just bonded us. He was such a good dog. Everywhere I went, he would go with me. If I went out in the Jeep to go down the mess hall, he would follow along right next to the Jeep. He would sit there and just wait till I got out and go with me. Every place I went, he'd go with me, no problem. Not a problem at all. Such a good animal. Except the time that he drank all the water out of Dave Mars's helmet, that he was shaving the helmet. You used the helmet as a wash basin in those days. That was the only time that Mickey ever got in trouble. And so well, that's another story. It's a long story. So he was stay with me, and when I was transferred, because Army had a rotation policy, when they transferred me from Tarawa to Majuro, I took Mickey with me. They said, "Oh, sure, you can take him with you." And I took him up to Majuro, and he's just a dad. As long as I was there, he was happy.
Great.
When the war was over and I had to go to Honolulu, I tried everything I could, Red Cross, everything, but Hawaii had that very strict ban on not importing any animals because of possibilities of rabies and all sorts of dog-borne disease or cat-borne disease. And of course today they still have some kind of a quarantine. It's a much shorter, much easier thing to do. But in those days it was almost impossible. So I checked around with people who were staying there, and I found a fellow that said he would give him a good home. And so I reluctantly bid farewell to Mickey when I got on my plane to go back to Kwajalein.
Tell us about some of the friends you made when you were in the service.
Well, you don't get to make too many friends because they transfer you and they transfer them. At least that's the way that these two outfits I worked in. And but one was a very interesting fellow. In some of the pictures I have here, he was the NCOIC for us down in Tarawa. He was an old, he'd been in the Coast Guard for some time. His name was Arthur Victor Hackett. He looks like he weighed about 120 pounds, short, and but he'd been in the Army before, and he went into the Coast Guard. And he'd been around the Coast Guard, and he was a second-class radio man. The rest of us were third class, and he was in charge. He'd been first class, and he'd been busted back down to striker, or busted down to third class and back up. He was not one to go by the rules and regulations. So anyhow, he was an excellent fellow to have in there, because he knew where to get things, how to swap for things. We needed this, we'd get that. They'd go down and get this, he'd swap it from somebody else. He'd get all these things, he'd appropriate things. We did pretty well. As long as Hackett was in there, and we ran the thing, and it ran well. Now, they did give us a second lieutenant from the Army Air Corps, who was going to be the communications officer, took care of us, and also the part of the communications station. They had it there for regular radio transmissions. And Hackett told him, okay, you take care of the paperwork and all the administrative stuff, and I'll take care of the operational part, and we'll get along fine. It did. And so we turned in some real good work on getting bearings and not losing any airplanes, and was a very good setup. And then when I got my material, Hackett came up there. Now he's not going to be NCOIC up there, just one of the troops, but he went right along with that, real happy with it. So I was pretty friendly with Hackett, and trying to think of anybody else I do know long enough to really get friends with. David Morris. I was in the school with him over on Kauai with him, and then back on Toronto with him. But I went up to Majuro, and he stayed there. So it wasn't exactly a place where you made long-term relationships. Like some of these people get assigned to a ship, and they're on that ship for a long time. But we were just here and there. Oh, yes. So we did. It was interesting. Toronto was interesting from the standpoint of this was a very bloody battle down there, and they'd blown up most of that island. But the Navy had come in with the Seabees and fixed it up, put in new structures. The Island Commander's unit was a real fine-looking grass hut up there, and they did a lot of good work there. And but it still stunk. You could never get away from that smell. And but we had interesting things there, like such as I say, you use your helmet as a wash basin, and that worked out fine. And your uniform of the day was usually shorts and a T-shirt. It was usually over 100 degrees, and one of those sun helmets. And that was also the place where they brought in Navy nurses. It made a little difference, and we had to have people assigned as guards on the nurses' quarters to march up and down as armed guard and keep out the people who wanted to come in and take a sneak at the tent to see what a nurse looked like. That was interesting. I was there. Yeah, I was going to say, I went to Majuro, and I got some good pictures of there. And Majuro, we had our DF station was way out at the end of it. It's a section of little atolls or coral outcroppings connected by a causeway that the Japanese had used it for recreation purposes for all of their troops in the Central Pacific. They can go back there. So it wasn't fortified, and there was no battle to take it. We just walked and picked it up. The palm trees were all still there, no big holes in the ground. But it also then became the Japanese prisoner camp for all the Central Pacific. We brought in all the prisoners. So when people say, where were you when the war ended? I could say, I was on an island in the Pacific surrounded by Japanese soldiers. Wow, oh, wow. I said, yeah, but they were all prisoners. And they were. And that was, now, we've seen and heard, and I wrote an article in the Coast Guard Combat Veterans magazine about how Japanese prisoners Japanese people treated our prisoners. And we saw these people who were just pictures of just skeletons and beaten and made to work in heavy industry. We had them over there. You can see from the one picture I did of this fellow who allowed me to sketch him, and they were well fed. I think we paid that Geneva Convention, whatever it was, I had it set for the day for any work they did, and they had all the food, all the good food they wanted to eat. And we would go down in the morning, and they would say, okay, how many do you need? Oh, I could take 5. They had these certain prisoners that were completely vetted, that they were safe and everything, and you would take 5 prisoners, put them in your personnel carrier, take them back to your squadron barracks. We were in closets in there, and then turn them loose. And they would they would make your beds, they would clean the floors, they would clean the heads, they would do everything to make the place just sparkling and fine and clean. We didn't have to do a thing there. They would police the outside. Then when they got through, they were usually through before we had to take them back. Then we'd turn them loose in the rec room and let them play ping pong, pool, read American magazines, bum American cigarettes. They were living. And nothing like our prisoners were treated in Japan, I'll tell you. And then one thing about it was the Red Cross and all these other agencies that were concerned with prisoners kept coming through there to see how we were treating these people, and consequently, we had the best food I've ever had in the service. We had chicken, we had prime rib, we had We had roast, prime rib, and we had steaks. We had all this good food because that way they thought, if you looked at the food we have here, and the Japanese could have the same food. They didn't want it. They wouldn't eat it. That wasn't their kind of food, but we had good food for them.